Imagine looking at your family portrait every single day, seeing the warm, smiling faces of the people you are supposed to trust most in the world, only to realize that a literal monster has been hiding in plain sight right next to you. That is the exact psychological horror I uncovered, and I am still trying to process the absolute, calculated evil that has been living under our roof, sharing our meals, and walking down our hallways. My name is Chloe, and I am 21 years old. To understand how completely my reality shattered into a million jagged pieces, you have to understand the life my mother and I were living before the nightmare revealed itself. For the first 16 years of my life, survival was a daily struggle. My biological father walked out on us when I was just a toddler, leaving my mother with a mountain of crushing debt, a stack of past due notices, and the impossible task of raising a child completely on her own in a ruthless, expensive world. My mom worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs, just to keep a leaky roof over our heads and a single hot meal on the table. We moved from one cramped, run-down apartment to another, constantly running from landlords, utilities being cut off, and the perpetual fear of homelessness. I watched my mother age decades in a matter of years, her hands calloused, her eyes constantly shadowed by the heavy, suffocating weight of anxiety. She sacrificed everything for me, skipping meals so I could eat, wearing shoes with holes in the soles so I could have a decent outfit for school. We were entirely alone in the world, 2 broken souls clinging to each other in a storm that never seemed to end. And then, like a miracle straight out of a movie, Richard entered our lives. I still remember the day my mom met him. She was working as a temporary legal secretary at a high-profile corporate firm downtown, and Richard was the senior partner handling a massive multi-million-dollar defense case. He was everything we weren't: calm, immensely wealthy, impeccably dressed, and radiating an aura of absolute power and security. He didn't just notice my mother, he courted her with a fierce, attentive devotion that completely swept her off her feet. For a woman who had been treated like dirt by the world for over a decade, Richard's entrance was like a warm blanket in the middle of a blizzard. Within a year, they were married. The day we moved out of our damp, mold-infested 2-room apartment and into Richard's estate was the day I thought all our suffering had finally come to an end. The property was an absolute masterpiece of luxury, a sprawling, 3-story historic mansion tucked away inside a heavily fortified, elite-gated community on the outskirts of the city. The house was surrounded by ancient, towering oak trees, perfectly manicured emerald lawns, and a massive brick wall topped with state-of-the-art security cameras that monitored every single square inch of the perimeter. To me, those walls didn't feel like a prison, they felt like a fortress built to keep the cruel, unpredictable world away from us forever. Richard didn't just provide us with a roof over our heads, he completely transformed our existence. He paid off every single one of my mother's lingering debts overnight. He bought her a luxury vehicle, filled her wardrobe with expensive designer clothes, and insisted on sending her to the finest medical specialists to treat the chronic health issues she had developed from years of grueling, hard labor. He treated me with the exact same overwhelming generosity. He legally adopted me, opened a massive trust fund for my university education, and always referred to me as his very own daughter. In the eyes of the public, Richard was a literal saint. He was one of the most prominent, highly respected criminal defense attorneys in the entire state. He was a man known for his flawless legal reputation, his brilliant mind in the courtroom, and his ability to win seemingly impossible cases for high-profile clients. When he wasn't commanding a courtroom in his tailored, custom-made Italian suits, he was dominating the local social scene as a major philanthropist. He regularly hosted lavish charity galas at the mansion, cutting massive checks for local orphanages, women's shelters, and community safety initiatives. The local media constantly ran feature profiles on him, painting him as the ultimate modern Renaissance man, an elite legal powerhouse, a pillar of the community, and a deeply devoted, loving family man. Richard was incredibly meticulous about his public image, but he was even more obsessed with the visual representation of our domestic perfection. For his and my mother's 3rd wedding anniversary, he didn't buy her jewelry or take her on a tropical vacation. Instead, he spent months searching for a renowned portrait artist to commission a massive, hyper-realistic, custom-framed oil painting of the 3 of us. When the painting was finally unveiled, it was breathtaking. It depicted the 3 of us standing together in the grand foyer of the mansion. Richard stood in the center, his tall, broad-shouldered frame commanding the canvas, wearing one of his signature dark charcoal suits. His large, strong hand was resting protectively on my mother's shoulder, while his other hand reached out toward me. My mother looked radiant, her eyes sparkling with a peace she had never known in her youth, and I was smiling brightly beside them. The artist had captured every detail with eerie precision, from the texture of the fabric to the subtle glint of light in our eyes. Richard insisted on hanging the massive portrait in the absolute center of our grand living room, right above the limestone fireplace, where it would be the very first thing anyone saw the moment they stepped through the front doors. Every single time we hosted a dinner party or a political fundraiser, Richard would lead his elite guests into the living room, point up at the canvas, and deliver the exact same speech with a warm, charming smile. That portrait represents the exact moment my life became completely whole. Out of all the victories I have ever achieved in a courtroom, saving these two beautiful women and building this perfect family is my greatest masterpiece. Hearing those words, watching the envious, admiring looks of our high society neighbors, I felt a deep, profound sense of gratitude. I used to look up at that painting every single morning as I walked down the grand staircase to get breakfast, using it as a mental anchor to remind myself that we were safe, that the nightmare of our past was over, and that we finally had a protector who loved us unconditionally. But looking back now, the sheer, terrifying irony of that statement makes my blood curdle. Richard was right about one thing. It was a masterpiece. But it wasn't a masterpiece of love or family. It was a masterpiece of absolute deception, a beautifully painted mask designed to hide a black, rotting void of pure psychological horror. The first cracks in the illusion began to form in the weeks leading up to last night, though my brain, desperately clinging to the comfort of our new life, refused to see them for what they truly were. It started with small, almost imperceptible shifts in Richard's behavior around the house. To the outside world, he remained the charming, charismatic savior, but behind closed doors, when he thought no one was watching, his perfection took on a rigid, almost mechanical quality. He became utterly consumed with the concept of absolute control over our daily schedules. He insisted on knowing the exact minute my mother left the house for her volunteer shifts, tracking her location through a family security app he had installed on our phones, under the guise of keeping us safe from the dangerous elements of the city. If I stayed late at the university library by even 15 minutes without sending a text message, I would walk through the front door to find Richard standing in the dim hallway, his tall silhouette completely motionless, waiting for me. He wouldn't yell or scream. Richard never raised his voice, but he would look at me with his cold, unblinking gray eyes and deliver a calm, softly spoken lecture about the fragility of safety and the importance of accountability. There was also a strange, suffocating atmosphere developing within the mansion itself. Despite its vast size and beautiful, high-ceilinged rooms, I began to feel an inexplicable sensation of being watched. It was a persistent, low-level paranoia that crawled along the back of my neck whenever I was alone in my bedroom or studying in the private library. I would suddenly turn around, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, only to find an empty corridor. I shrugged it off as a lingering symptom of my childhood anxiety, a foolish side effect of moving from a cramped apartment where privacy didn't exist to a massive estate where every sound echoed like a ghost. I told myself I was being ungrateful. I told myself that Richard's hypervigilance was just the natural byproduct of his profession as a criminal defense attorney. After all, his entire career was built on dealing with the darkest, most violent segments of society. He spent his days analyzing crime scenes, cross-examining predators, and navigating the twisted mechanics of the criminal underworld. It made perfect sense that a man who witnessed the horrors of the world on a daily basis would want to create an impenetrable, flawless sanctuary for his family. I had no idea that the sanctuary he built wasn't meant to keep the monsters out. It was a hunting ground, carefully designed to keep his prey completely contained. The trap finally sprung last night. It was a dark, oppressive Tuesday evening, and the sky had been bruised a deep, heavy purple since mid-afternoon. The local weather reports had been issuing severe weather warnings for hours, predicting a historic, violent summer storm system that was sweeping across the valley, carrying torrential downpours, flash floods, and destructive high winds. Despite the ominous weather, Richard and my mother had a mandatory social obligation they couldn't avoid. It was the annual Corporate Law and Regional Charity Gala downtown, a massive, black tie event where Richard was not only the keynote speaker, but also the guest of honor, receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award for his philanthropic contributions to the city. My mother had spent days preparing her dress, and Richard had been meticulously reviewing his speech in his private study for a week. Around 7 o'clock in the evening, the sleek, black luxury sedan pulled up to the front portico of the mansion. I stood in the grand foyer, watching as Richard helped my mother into her elegant evening gown, wrapping a heavy silk shawl around her shoulders to protect her from the rising wind. He looked like the absolute epitome of class and nobility. He turned to me, his handsome, sharp-jawed face softening into a warm smile. "We should be back by midnight at the absolute latest, Chloe," he said, his deep resonant voice echoing softly off the marble floors. "The storm looks like it's going to hit hard, so make sure all the windows are locked tightly. I've activated the main gate security grid, so you are completely safe inside. Don't stay up too late studying." "I won't. Congratulations on the award, Richard," I replied, feeling a genuine wave of pride for the man who had mended our broken lives. My mother leaned over, gave me a soft kiss on the cheek, and whispered how much she loved me. Then, Richard took her hand, opened the heavy umbrella, and guided her out into the darkness. I watched the red taillights of the sedan disappear down the long, winding driveway, passing through the massive iron gates before they automatically slammed shut, locking the rest of the world out. I was completely alone in the mansion. For the first few hours, everything was peaceful. I retreated to my second-floor bedroom, put on some music to drown out the distant, low rumbling of thunder, and spread my university textbooks across my desk. I tried to focus on my studies, but as the clock ticked past 10, the storm outside truly began to unleash its fury. The wind transformed from a distant howl into a violent, screeching force that rattled the heavy, double-paned glass windows of the estate. Sheets of torrential rain slammed against the brick exterior like a barrage of small stones, and the thunder cracks grew so loud and close that they literally vibrated the floorboards beneath my feet. Then, right around 11:45, the storm delivered its final, decisive blow. With a blinding, sky-ripping flash of lightning that illuminated my entire room in a harsh electric blue, a deafening crack of thunder boomed directly overhead. A split second later, a massive power surge ripped through the local electrical grid. The lights in my room flickered violently twice, buzzing like an angry hornet, and then plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The music cut out instantly. The low hum of the central heating and air conditioning died, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake, broken only by the raw, chaotic fury of the storm outside. I sat frozen in my chair for a moment, my heart skipping a beat as my eyes tried to adjust to the total absence of light. I reached out blindly across the desk, my fingers searching through the darkness until they wrapped around the cool metal of my smartphone. I clicked the screen on, the bright artificial glare of the display blinding me for a second. The battery icon showed 40%, and the signal bar was completely dead. The storm had knocked out the local cellular towers along with the power grid. A sudden, sharp wave of vulnerability hit me. The mansion, which had felt so warm and secure just hours ago, suddenly felt cold, foreign, and massive in the dark. I knew I needed to find the emergency supply kit. Richard had always told us that he kept a large stock of heavy-duty flashlights, emergency candles, and a first aid kit inside the utility closet near the grand kitchen on the ground floor. I turned on my phone's built-in flashlight, casting a narrow, trembling beam of white light into the deep shadows of my bedroom. Taking a deep breath to steady my racing pulse, I pushed open my bedroom door and stepped out onto the vast, cavernous second-floor landing. The grand staircase stretched out before me, descending into the pitch-black abyss of the lower levels. The beam of my phone flashlight sliced through the darkness, catching the dust motes dancing in the air, but the light was swallowed up by the immense scale of the house. Every single step I took down the polished hardwood stairs felt incredibly loud, the creaking of the wood echoing through the silent mansion like a warning. As I reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped into the grand foyer, I began making my way toward the living room, intending to cut through it to reach the kitchen hallway. The air inside the house felt heavy, thick with humidity that had somehow seeped through the ancient brickwork during the storm. I raised my phone, sweeping the beam of light across the living room to guide my steps. The light washed over the expensive leather sofas, the hand-woven Persian rugs, and the dark mahogany bookshelves. And then, the beam shifted, catching the massive, custom-framed family portrait hanging prominently above the limestone fireplace. I stopped dead in my tracks. Under normal circumstances, the painting was a source of immense comfort. But in the stark, trembling light of my phone flashlight, the oil painting took on an entirely different, deeply unsettling appearance. The shadows cast by the frame made the painted faces of my mother and me look gaunt, almost hollowed out. But it was Richard's painted face that made me freeze. The angle of my flashlight beam hit the canvas in a way that highlighted the textured brushstrokes around his eyes, making his painted expression look completely devoid of human warmth, rigid, calculating, and cold. I shook my head, silently scolding myself for letting my imagination run wild in the dark. I took a step forward, intending to look away and continue toward the kitchen. But as the beam of my flashlight shifted slightly across the canvas, a tiny brilliant speck of light flashed back at me from the painting itself. I stopped again, my breath catching in my throat. I raised the phone, focusing the intense, narrow beam of the flashlight directly onto Richard's painted face. I stepped closer, moving past the hearth, until I was standing less than a foot away from the massive frame, staring directly into the painted image of my stepfather's left eye. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs, a sudden, primal wave of terror washing over my entire body. There, drilled with absolute microscopic precision directly through the center of the painted pupil of Richard's left eye, was a tiny pinhole. And deep inside that dark pinhole, completely invisible under the normal, ambient lighting of the room, a microscopic, faint green digital light was blinking in a steady, rhythmic pattern. It was a camera. My mind completely short-circuited. A wave of intense nausea hit me so hard my knees grew weak. I stared at the tiny blinking green light, my brain desperately trying to find a rational, innocent explanation. Maybe it was part of the home security system? Maybe it was a motion sensor to protect the expensive painting from being stolen? But even as those desperate excuses formed in my mind, a deeper, instinctual truth told me otherwise. The camera wasn't pointed out toward the windows to watch for intruders. It was pointed directly at the family sofa. It was pointed directly at the entrance of the room. It was designed to watch us. Driven by a sudden, frantic burst of adrenaline, I reached my trembling hands behind the heavy, gilded wooden frame of the portrait. I expected my fingers to meet the solid, flat drywall of the living room wall. Instead, my hands slipped into a deep recessed gap behind the frame. I gripped the edge of the heavy wooden frame and pulled with all my remaining strength. I expected the painting to resist, to screech against the mounting brackets. Instead, with a soft, effortless click, the entire massive canvas swung wide open on a set of heavily oiled, hidden industrial magnetic hinges. The portrait didn't just conceal a wall cavity, it was a door. As the painting swung open, the beam of my phone flashlight cut through the newly created opening, revealing a sight that made the breath completely leave my lungs. Cut directly through the drywall, and slicing straight into the thick, reinforced concrete foundation of the mansion, was a dark, narrow, recessed corridor. The air that rushed out of the hidden opening was freezing, a sharp, icy draft that smelled heavily of industrial bleach, old dust, and a faint, metallic tang that I couldn't quite identify. The corridor stretched back into the darkness, a set of steep, brutalist concrete stairs descending down into the deepest, unexcavated bowels of the basement. I stood paralyzed in the center of our beautiful, luxurious living room, staring into the dark throat of a secret labyrinth hidden inside our house. The contrast was a psychological assault. On one side was the million-dollar mansion of a celebrated philanthropist, and on the other was a dark, concrete void that felt like the entrance to a tomb. Every single survival instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, to run out of the front doors, to brave the violent storm outside, and to never step foot inside this house again. But a terrifying magnetic pull took hold of me. My mother was out there in the world, completely alone with this man, trusting him with her life, her health, and her heart. If Richard was hiding something this monumentally deceptive, I had to know what it was. I had to find the truth, because our lives depended on it. With my hands shaking so violently I could barely keep a grip on my phone, I stepped through the hidden frame, took my first step onto the freezing concrete stairs, and began my descent into the absolute darkness of Richard's secret life. The hidden concrete staircase felt completely endless. With every step I took deeper into the foundation of the mansion, the temperature dropped significantly until my breath was coming out in faint, ghostly plumes of white mist in the beam of my phone flashlight. The chaotic fury of the thunderstorm upstairs began to fade, replaced by a suffocating, heavy silence that pressed against my eardrums like deep ocean water. The walls on either side of me were rough, unpainted cinder blocks, completely devoid of the luxury that defined the world above. The intense smell of industrial bleach grew stronger, stinging the back of my throat and making my eyes water, but underneath it, that sharp, unmistakable scent of damp copper lingered in the air. I kept one hand pressed against the cold concrete wall to steady myself, my sneakers making a soft, scraping sound against the grit on the stairs. My brain was screaming at me to turn back, but the memory of my mother's smiling face as she left for the gala kept my feet moving forward. I had to know what kind of man we had let into our lives. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the steep stairs leveled out into a narrow, low-ceilinged corridor. I swept the trembling beam of my phone flashlight down the hallway. At the very end of the passage stood a massive, industrial-grade steel security door. It looked like something you would find in a high-security military bunker or a bank vault. It was completely seamless, painted a dull, matte black, and set deeply into a reinforced steel frame. In the center of the door, glowing with an ominous independent battery power that survived the storm's blackout, was a digital touchscreen keypad. I approached the door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stared at the glowing blue numbers of the keypad, my mind racing. I didn't know the code. Richard had never mentioned a hidden room, let alone given anyone a password to it, but as I stared at the digital panel, I forced myself to think like him. Richard was a man of absolute mathematical precision. He didn't do anything by coincidence, and he valued efficiency above all else. I took a deep breath, extended a trembling index finger, and entered the numerical code to our home's primary security grid, the date he married my mother. I pressed the final digit. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, a sharp, electronic chime echoed through the narrow corridor, followed by the heavy, mechanical clanking of internal steel deadbolts disengaging inside the door. The digital screen flashed green. The lock was open. A wave of pure adrenaline hit me. I placed my palm against the freezing metal surface of the door and pushed. It was incredibly heavy, but it swung open smoothly on perfectly balanced hydraulic hinges, revealing a pitch-black room that felt absolutely massive. I stepped inside, my phone flashlight cutting through the darkness. I swept the beam across the room, expecting to find a private safe, a wine cellar, or perhaps a hidden storage unit for his sensitive legal files. But the moment the light illuminated the interior, my knees literally buckled, and I had to catch myself against the edge of a heavy metal desk to prevent myself from collapsing to the floor. The hidden room was a high-tech, soundproofed surveillance hub. Lining the far wall from floor to ceiling were massive racks of black digital servers, their tiny modems buzzing with a low, collective hum. Above the servers hung a grid of over 24 high-definition flat-screen monitors. Even though the main house had lost power, these screens were entirely functional, powered by an independent backup generator hidden deep within the basement walls. And every single one of those screens was displaying a live, crystal-clear video feed. I staggered closer to the monitors, my hands flying over my mouth to stifle a scream of pure horror. The screens weren't monitoring the exterior perimeter gates or the surrounding walls of the estate. They were pointed inward. One screen showed a high-angle view of my mother's master bedroom, focusing directly on her bed. Another screen showed my private bathroom, the camera positioned directly inside the vent above the shower. There were cameras hidden in the kitchen, the private library, the hallways, the closets, and even my own bedroom, positioned from a high angle near the ceiling fan. Richard had systematically turned our entire sanctuary into a digital panopticon. Every private moment, every vulnerable second, every conversation my mother and I had ever had over the past 5 years had been recorded, monitored, and analyzed by the man we called our protector. I felt completely violated, an intense burning wave of nausea washing over me as I realized that the creeping sensation of being watched I had felt for months wasn't paranoia at all. It was real. He had been watching me sleep. He had been watching me get dressed. He had been cataloging our entire lives like lab rats in a cage. But as my flashlight beam shifted down toward the massive steel desk in the center of the room, I realized that the surveillance grid was only the tip of a much larger, infinitely more terrifying iceberg. The surface of the desk was meticulously organized, matching Richard's obsessive neatness. In the center sat a high-end laptop, a digital audio mixer, and a neat stack of identical, thick manila legal folders. I stepped up to the desk, my hands shaking so violently I could barely function, and picked up the very first folder on the stack. The label on the tab didn't contain a client's name or a corporate case file number. It simply had a date written in black marker, the 14th of October 2022. I opened the folder, and the breath completely left my body. Clipped to the inside cover was a gruesome, high-resolution crime scene photograph of a young woman lying in a ditch near the state park on the edge of the city. I recognized her face instantly. Her name was Sarah Jennings. She was a 24-year-old law student who had mysteriously vanished 4 years ago, a case that had gripped the local news for months before completely going cold. I frantically flipped through the pages. The folder contained intercepted police investigative reports, original forensic autopsy data that had never been released to the public, and pages of handwritten notes in Richard's elegant, precise cursive handwriting. The notes detailed her daily schedule, her route home from the university, her vulnerabilities, and a final, chilling entry written in cold, analytical prose. Target secured at 11:14 p.m., 0 complications, containment successful. My mind began to spin into a vortex of pure, unadulterated terror. Richard hadn't been defending criminals. He was studying them to perfect his own methodology. I dropped the folder and grabbed the second one on the stack. The 3rd of March 2024. Inside were the personal documents, medical records, and tracking logs of another missing woman, a local barista named Emily Vance, who had disappeared from a downtown parking garage 2 years ago. And clipped to the very back of her file, inside a clear plastic evidence bag, was her actual driver's license, her silver engagement ring, and a lock of her hair. They weren't legal files, they were trophies. Richard wasn't just a prominent attorney or a wealthy philanthropist. He was a highly calculated, untraceable serial predator who had been operating in our city for years, using his elite legal power, his intimate knowledge of police forensic tactics, and his perfect public reputation to completely cover up his own horrific crimes. He had built a flawless public mask to hide the monster beneath, and he had married my mother to create the ultimate, unsuspected domestic cover. I stood in the center of that freezing high-tech tomb, clutching the stolen files to my chest, tears of absolute horror finally spilling over my eyelids. The man who sat at our dinner table, the man who kissed my mother goodbye, the man who paid for my education, he was a monster. Suddenly, the silence of the bunker was violently shattered. My phone, which I had placed face up on the desk to use as a flashlight, vibrated aggressively against the metal surface. The sudden noise made me jump back, a sharp gasp escaping my throat. I lunged forward and grabbed the device. It was an automated push notification from our smart home security application. The localized cellular network was still dead, but my phone had automatically connected to the bunker's private generator-powered local Wi-Fi network. The notification read, "Front gate override. Primary user entered perimeter." My blood turned to pure ice. I quickly tapped the notification, opening the live security camera feed that monitored the mansion's main entrance. Through the grainy, night vision lens cutting through the pouring rain, I watched the massive iron gates swing wide open. Richard's sleek black luxury sedan rolled slowly down the driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of a predator. They were home. They had left the gala early because of the storm. Panic, cold and sharp, locked my muscles. I had to get out of there. I had to grab these files, run up the stairs, close the portrait, and find a way to escape before he walked through the front door. I scrambled to stuff the files back into a neat stack, gripping them tightly against my chest. But before I could even take a single step toward the heavy steel door, a faint, mechanical whirring sound echoed from the wall behind me. I slowly turned around, my flashlight beam catching a tiny, motion-activated monitor mounted next to the server racks. It was a live feed of the narrow concrete corridor I had just walked down, the only exit from the basement. On the screen, my heart completely stopped. The hidden portrait door in the grand living room upstairs was wide open. And standing at the very top of the concrete stairs, his tall, broad-shouldered silhouette, perfectly framed against the dim light of the living room, was Richard. He was completely alone. He had sent my mother upstairs, or perhaps she was still in the car. He was wearing his expensive charcoal gala suit, but his silk tie was completely loosened, and in his right hand, he was holding a heavy iron flashlight. He didn't look angry on the screen. His face was entirely expressionless, a cold, dead mask of pure calculation. He raised his flashlight, stepped over the threshold, and began walking down the concrete stairs. Slowly, deliberately. The heavy, rhythmic thud of his leather dress shoes against the concrete began to echo down the corridor, getting louder and closer with every passing second. He knew someone was down here. He knew the vault had been breached, and I was completely trapped at the bottom of the steps with nowhere left to run. The heavy, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of Richard's leather shoes against the concrete steps sounded like a countdown to my execution. The sound was magnifying as it traveled down the narrow corridor, vibrating directly into the soles of my shoes. I was trapped in a reinforced steel bunker, 30 feet underground, with a highly calculated killer blocking the only exit. Adrenaline fired through my nervous system, breaking the paralysis of my fear. My eyes frantically swept the high-tech surveillance room. There were no back doors, no hidden ventilation shafts large enough to crawl through, and no windows. There was only the massive metal desk, the spinning server racks, and the shadow beneath the heavy workstation. Thinking fast, I dropped to my knees, clutching the manila folders tightly against my chest to prevent the papers from rustling. I wedged my body into the narrow knee well beneath the heavy steel desk, pulling my legs in tightly and curling into a ball. I squeezed my eyes shut, holding my breath until my lungs burned, praying that the darkness beneath the desk would be enough to save me. A second later, the heavy steel door creaked fully open. The beam of Richard's heavy iron flashlight sliced through the room, cutting a sharp path across the server racks and reflecting off the blank surveillance monitors. I could see the polished tips of his black leather dress shoes step into the room, stopping just 2 feet away from the desk where I lay hidden. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the low, mechanical hum of the servers. I could hear him breathing calm, slow, and completely controlled. He wasn't panting from rushing down the stairs. He was hunting. "Chloe," Richard's deep, resonant voice echoed softly against the concrete walls. It was the exact same tone he used when giving a lecture on safety, completely devoid of anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "I know you're down here, sweetheart. You left the portrait door open upstairs, and you connected to my private network." My heart battered against my ribs so hard I was certain he could hear it. I bit my lip until I tasted blood, forcing myself to remain completely motionless. "You're an intelligent girl, Chloe," he continued, his footsteps shifting slightly as he walked around the perimeter of the desk. The beam of his flashlight swept right past my hiding spot, missing my shoulder by mere inches. "You inherit that from your mother. But intelligence without caution is a very dangerous thing. You've walked into a situation that you simply don't understand." He stopped walking, standing directly in front of the desk now. I heard him place his heavy iron flashlight onto the metal surface above my head with a soft metallic clink. "Those files you were looking at. They aren't what you think," Richard said, his voice dropping to a low, conversational whisper. "In my line of work, you have to understand the criminal mind completely if you want to defeat it. I keep archives. I keep evidence that the police are too incompetent to analyze. I am building cases, Chloe. I am protecting this city." It was a masterful lie, delivered with the absolute confidence of an elite defense attorney. But I had seen the driver's licenses. I had seen the jewelry. I knew the truth. "Come out from wherever you are hiding," he said, his voice hardening just a fraction, a cold edge finally slipping through his perfect composure. "Let's go upstairs, make some tea, and talk about this like a family. Your mother is sleeping soundly in her bed. There is no need to disturb her over a simple misunderstanding." That was the psychological trigger that broke my terror. He thought my mother was asleep. He thought he could isolate me, manipulate me, or eliminate me before she ever woke up. I looked down at the phone clutched in my hand. The battery icon was flashing red at just 2%. The local cellular network was still completely dead due to the storm, but I was still connected to his underground Wi-Fi network. I remembered that Richard's elite legal firm utilized a high-end, independent cloud-based backup server for all their corporate data, and because he was an absolute perfectionist, he had synced the mansion's private local network to that same encrypted drive. With trembling fingers, I lowered the brightness of my phone screen to 0. Working entirely by touch in the shadows beneath the desk, I opened my phone's camera app. I held the device tightly against the legal folders clutched to my chest, angling the camera up toward the clear plastic evidence bags containing Sarah Jennings and Emily Vance's driver's licenses. Click, click. The digital shutter was silent, but the screen illuminated the horrific evidence for a fraction of a second. I frantically selected the photos, hit the share icon, and forced them into the shared firm cloud drive labeled Richard Miller, Active Archives. I knew that the moment the firm's legal IT department opened their network logs in the morning, those gruesome trophies would be flagged automatically on their main servers, completely outside of Richard's localized control. The progress bar on my screen crawled forward, 80%, 90%, upload, complete. Just as the upload finished, my phone screen flashed violently once and went completely dead. The battery was entirely gone. Up above, I heard Richard take a slow, deep breath. "Well, Chloe, if you won't cooperate, I suppose I'll just have to find you myself." I heard his large hand reach down to pick up the iron flashlight from the desk. This was it. In a matter of seconds, he was going to bend down, look into the knee, well, and find me trapped like an animal. Gathering every single ounce of physical strength and primal fury I had left, I didn't wait for him to look. I shoved the thick legal folders out of the knee well ahead of me, throwing them violently directly at his shins. "What the?" Richard lunged backward as the heavy manila folders erupted from beneath the desk, papers and crime scene photos scattering wildly across the concrete floor. Before he could regain his balance, I threw my body forward, scrambling out from beneath the desk. I didn't try to stand up. I stayed low, throwing my entire physical weight directly into the side of his knee. With a sharp gasp of surprise, Richard's leg buckled beneath him. He stumbled sideways, his heavy iron flashlight slipping from his grip and clattering loudly across the floor, its beams spinning wildly in the dark. I didn't waste a single millisecond looking back. I scrambled to my feet, my lungs screaming for oxygen, and sprinted toward the heavy steel security door. I burst through the opening and tore down the narrow concrete corridor, my sneakers flying across the floorboards. "Chloe, stop!" Richard's voice roared from behind me. No longer calm, no longer controlled. It was the raw, furious screech of a monster whose mask had been completely ripped away. I reached the bottom of the steep concrete staircase and began clawing my way up, using my hands and knees to pull myself up the brutalist steps in the pitch-black darkness. I could hear his heavy footsteps entering the corridor behind me, closing the distance with terrifying speed. I reached the top of the stairs, threw my body through the open frame of the family portrait, and tumbled out onto the hardwood floor of the grand living room. The thunderstorm outside was still raging, lightning flashes illuminating the room in a chaotic, strobe-like pattern. I scrambled to my feet, intending to run up the grand staircase to wake my mother, but as I turned around, I froze. Standing at the top of the living room landing, staring down at me with wide, terrified eyes, was my mom. She was wearing her silk bathrobe, clutching a candle in her hand, trembling from the sound of the screaming downstairs. "Chloe, what is going on? Why are you screaming?" she cried out, her voice shaking. Before I could answer, the family portrait door violently swung wide open. Richard stepped through the frame, his face contorted into a mask of pure, venomous rage, his charcoal suit covered in concrete dust. In his right hand, he was holding a wicked, high-caliber handgun, the exact same weapon I had seen in his investigative files. "Mom, run!" I screamed, throwing myself in front of the staircase. "He's a monster. He's the one who killed those girls. He has a surveillance bunker under the house." My mother looked from me to Richard, her entire reality fracturing in real time. Richard instantly stopped, his entire demeanor shifting back into a calm, reassuring performance in a split second. He lowered the gun slightly, looking up at my mother with soft, pleading eyes. "Darling, listen to me," Richard said, his voice smooth and comforting. "Chloe has had a severe psychological break, the storm, the stress of her exams. She broke into my private legal vault and is completely hallucinating. I need you to step away from her. She's dangerous." For a single, agonizing second, the room was completely silent except for the howling wind outside. My mother looked at the man she loved, the man who had saved us from poverty, and then she looked at me, her daughter, bleeding from her knees, crying tears of absolute terror. The bond of a mother is something a monster like Richard could never calculate. My mother didn't hesitate. She dropped the candle, leaped down the remaining steps, and threw her body directly in front of mine, shielding me from his weapon. "Don't you dare touch my daughter, Richard," she roared. Richard's face grew completely cold. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a dead, hollow stare. He raised the high-caliber handgun, pointing it directly at my mother's chest. "I built this perfect life for us," he whispered, his voice an absolute chill. "I saved you, and you're going to let a bitter, ungrateful child ruin everything?" He tightened his finger around the trigger. I closed my eyes, preparing for the devastating sound of the gunshot. But instead of a gunshot, a sudden violent crash echoed from the front of the mansion. The heavy reinforced oak front doors were violently blown off their hinges, crashing onto the marble floor of the foyer. The blinding headlights of 4 flashing police cruisers cut through the pouring rain outside, illuminating the grand living room in brilliant red and blue. "State police, drop the weapon! Hands in the air!" a voice boomed through a megaphone from the front lawn. The legal firm's IT security team hadn't waited until morning. The automated alert from the uploaded crime scene trophies had triggered an immediate, high-priority federal notification. Because of Richard's elite standing, the regional authorities had mobilized instantly, tracking the digital upload directly back to the mansion's dedicated server core. Richard stood frozen on the living room rug, his gun still pointed at us, his eyes darting frantically from my mother to the front door where 6 heavily armed tactical officers were rushing inside, their weapons trained directly on his chest. He realized, in that exact second, that the courtroom was closed. The evidence was entirely outside of his power to destroy. The mask was gone forever. Slowly, Deliberately, Richard dropped the handgun onto the floor, raising his hands into the air as the officers tackled him to the ground, pinning his face against the polished wood. Today, the mansion stands completely empty, surrounded by yellow police tape. The grand family portrait was taken down by forensic investigators, stripped away to reveal the dark mechanism of a predator's hunting ground. My mother and I are back in a small, cramped apartment on the other side of the state. We have no money, no luxury, and our names are plastered across every true crime documentary and news outlet in the country. The high society neighbors who used to envy us now look away when they see us, treating us like a curse. But every single night when my mother and I sit down to share a simple, humble meal, we look at each other with a deep, unbreakable peace. True safety isn't built on million-dollar walls, expensive suits, or beautiful painted illusions. True safety is having the courage to face the absolute darkest horrors of reality, knowing that as long as you hold on to the truth, the monster will never truly win.